So in our last couple of videos, we have been talking about the We Are Church practice of multiplication of leaders and churches. And so we spent majority of our last video talking about the multiplication of churches and how that functions. And now we want to shift to talking more about leadership. It's such an important topic in the church. As we think about and press into rethinking church process, we have to be rethinking leadership, but we have to make sure we're doing that biblically. And what Rob and I have experienced is seeing how we can easily approach this topic more out of emotion or practicality. There's just a variety of different ways we can approach leadership. And so we need to make sure that we are as biblical as possible in the area of leadership. One thing we have noticed is in this process of rethinking church, a lot of people have kind of written out leadership where they go, man, we're gathering together. We don't have leaders. And oftentimes there'll be very spiritual language like, hey, Jesus is the head. We don't need any human head. We're under Jesus. That sounds great. Problem is that's not biblical. In scripture, we see the establishment of elders. We see Paul in the book of Acts as he would preach the gospel in a place, he would come back through and help establish elders. In Titus 1:5, he writes to Titus and he says, put into order what was left unfinished and appoint elders. The establishment of spiritual authority and elders in the local church is very important. It's kind of like if a group of kids were to get together and hang out at the park and go, you know what? We're actually a family. We're a family. The question, though, that anybody observing that would ask is, well, where are your parents? And how you can't just say you're a family. It really drills into the question of what is a church? How do you plan a church? And how can a church function without spiritual authority? And there's so many parallels in the Bible between family and church. The church is supposed to function in a lot of ways like a family. And you see the spiritual authority functions in a lot of ways like a parent, like Paul is saying to the Thessalonians, he's comparing his leadership to being like a father and a mother, caring for them in that way. It's very biblical. Rob, maybe you would want to say more on that, but also I'm hoping you could speak to why we might resist this. What have you seen in this process of people rethinking church according to scripture? Why might they resist leadership?
Mostly people get hurt in the church or have bad leadership in a family, not even in the church, but it creates this anti-authority mentality where you've had bad leadership or bad parenting. And so then you see any kind of leadership or authority as negative, and that's not biblical. God has definitely placed spiritual covering and oversight and authority in the church governance and in the family. Sometimes people that are not ready to lead or necessarily healthy parents live that way. It affects the body. It affects the way people see authority in their lives. Hurt is one of the main reasons people might have experienced some type of control or viewed it as controlling and felt like, man, I don't want to be under that type of control. You could just look at the news. There's a lot of bad stuff the church has experienced. You know, it's not a secret. There has been really controlling, money seeking, prosperity gospel type of teachings that have plagued the church. It's horrible. And that can make people feel like, man, I don't trust leadership at all. They try to control, they try to take my money. So bad experiences all around. And then the last thing is just bad understanding of what the church is, bad ecclesiology. When people don't understand that God actually developed the church to have spiritual parents and care and covering. If you're not reading the Bible and trying to read it through like, no, we're all just get to do whatever we want, then you're missing it. You're missing a whole part of the way that Jesus is the head. And then he put people to lead other people and help other people grow spiritually and take care of them. I was thinking of the passage in Thessalonians where it calls us to appreciate those who labor amongst us and have charge over us in the Lord, to esteem them very highly. That's the call for us as people that are being led by other people, Jesus still being the head, but to esteem those people very highly and appreciate them for their love and labor, because it's not easy to shepherd people and to care for people. It's not easy to parent. but it's the same dynamic, right? Like children do not sometimes see how valuable their parents are until they're a little bit older and realize, wow, that was actually really hard kid to parent. And it's the same thing with church, even though they're adults, you don't realize until later. And you're trying to lead and disciple somebody that you're saying like, wow, I could have been a lot more loving and appreciative towards the leaders that God placed over me. So those are a few reasons I went along on that one. No conviction
That's
around
good.
it.
It's good. I think about the culture we're in is important for us as believers to observe, think intentionally about the culture setting we're in. Like, what is the air we're breathing, the water we're swimming in? We are in a
Mhm.
very anti-authoritarian sort of culture, and it's increasingly becoming so, right? Hear about the scandal that happened in XYZ church in other state that I've never even heard of that church before, but an article gets put in front of me about how the pastor fell. A lot of unfortunate things going on in the body, and I'm not trying to minimize that. We are just, it's not even just authority within the church, but just authority in general. We are right now in our cultural moment really struggle with authority. So when you're talking about that, it's so important for each of us to take note of what we're being programmed to think and feel, and then to try to go the opposite as far as appreciating leadership. It's one thing for somebody to not be mad at leaders and not hate them, but to go to the degree of appreciating leaders. I know Francis would talk often about the posture of the Christian heart. We should be thankful to be under authority. That is part of how God has created us to function, that we're under Jesus's authority, and that we would be thankful for godly leadership. It's almost like, especially as kids in our current setting, the most popular thing to talk about is how hard you had it as a kid. Some people really did legitimately have it hard, but I've even noticed myself, like I had pretty good childhood. My parents weren't perfect, but in conversations, there's a temptation to point out failures, just to nitpick as though because somebody's in leadership, they're going to be perfect.
I think everything you're saying, we've talked about, all of the talk that goes around is so negative around police officers, around government, around everything. It's embedded everywhere to be anti-leadership. And it wasn't like that 50 years ago. It's changing so fast. Could you imagine where we're headed in 20 years? Do you think it will look any different with all the scandals going on and nothing's hidden anymore? It's all being exposed, but it doesn't just like you're saying, it's tempting just to go in that direction. It's all bad, no leaders, no nothing. If you read the scriptures, see that God actually ordained some type of leadership and covering and fathering and spiritual mothering and all that stuff. So I just say fight that temptation.
Yeah. And so then I think it leads appropriately into qualification for leadership, right? The point is not, hey, people in the church shouldn't care about if there's problems in the church or problems in leadership. We should care about those things. We need to submit to spiritual authority. But also from the leader's angle, then we need to be really intentional about how we approach discerning who should be a leader, what qualifies somebody, how do you appoint, all those sort of things. We want to get into some of those things here in this video and probably more in the next one. So what is the qualification for leadership? I would argue that we've set a very unbiblical bar. I think oftentimes people connect a leader is qualified based on having gone to seminary, being a really good communicator, based like different personality. There's a lot of different things, gifting that can be connected to what it means to be a pastor. And I've oftentimes had people, I just had this conversation a week ago where this couple came over to my home and interested in joining We Are Church here in Cleveland. One of the questions he asked was, where'd you go to seminary? And I'm like, well, I didn't. And I think that's a problem in the church today, that we tend to think every person in spiritual authority needs to have gone to seminary. He kind of was like, And by the end, they're like, this is not the right fit for us. He didn't say that overtly, but you could just feel it. And there's such expectations on that. And I think part of what we've done is we've made it so there's only a very few number of people who can actually lead in the church. Like people that have enough resources and education to be able to go to seminary. Also, oftentimes it's like people who, If you're going to plant a church, they need to be able to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they need to have connections. There's a lot of different things. You need to be able to stand in front of people and deliver like really well articulated message, all these different things. And I think what we've done is kind of become like a hotel, where with a hotel, you think about how many people could actually run a hotel. I would say there's very few people who could do that. You have to be able to own and run a hotel, you have to have a ton of capital. You need to have a lot of know-how. There's very few people that could do that. But how many people could start and operate an Airbnb? There's a lot of people. And part of the challenge is we've made church a lot more like a hotel, very complicated, where a very unique type of leader can lead it. And Airbnb, part of what it's done as far as being like coming a cultural phenomenon is it's empowered the everyday person to accommodate people in their home and compete with the hotel. And so with small, simple gatherings, what it does is it pulls back on some of the complexity that requires very skilled leaders. When you're talking about somebody pastoring a church out of their home, you're saying, be a spiritual parent for 15. Now, that is challenging. It's just in a different way. It requires a high degree of character. And that's what God laid out in Titus chapter 1. I just want to read. This is coming out of the passage I mentioned earlier in Titus 1:5, where Paul instructs, and I'll just read it. Verse 5. This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. For an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. So biblically, this is all about character. Even in how an elder handles the word, it's not saying he needs to be extremely eloquent and be able to keep everybody's attention. It's saying he needs to hold firm to the word. He needs to be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and rebuke those who contradict the word of God. Those are things that mostly have to do with the heart, like a heart posture towards God, a love for his word, the ability to instruct people in the word, and to rebuke people who contradict it. Often in the church today, it doesn't feel like somebody who possesses these qualities is qualified based on this because we've made it so complex. So I think part of what I'm advocating for is we need to simplify. It is helpful to simplify for a more pure perspective in on leadership. And what are we looking for a leader to do? Primarily when I'm appointing an elder, I'm not looking for him to manage budgets. I'm not looking for him to run programs. I'm looking for him to be a spiritual father, to care for people, to with integrity lead people. This is where we've made a lot of missteps, I believe, in the church today, is when you have people in leadership who don't have this solid character, when they've been qualified based on other things, and then you look at their character kind of briefly, and you're like, it seems good. And then it ends up blowing up. Rob, maybe I want to kick it to you now. Like, why do you think the character qualification is so important? How does ignoring this potentially end up leading towards blowups?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Scriptures give us imperatives like commands. This is what a leader should be like. So it's super important when God says something and he repeats himself and he emphasizes it in many ways. Like, we have to pay attention to that. The temptation is to do the opposite. We're always going to want to go after gifting instead of character because it's more effective. It looks better. It feels better when somebody can get things done. That's always a temptation, but we see the Lord's heart when he's choosing people, even in the Old Testament, when he's choosing David, they line up the brothers and like, no, there's another one. God doesn't choose by appearance or productivity. He looks at the heart. He looks differently at what's inside. We're just so natural minded in this way, but you see, even Jesus, as he chooses his 12 guys, he's not choosing rock star preachers or teachers or Pharisees. He's choosing people that are humble and moldable and have a lot of flaws, but he's choosing differently. And so that's our heart to look after, like, don't look at things the way that people do. Now, with the gifting and character, it's going to be a temptation. We're a small house church, right? We have 12, 13 people. We have like maybe 18 people. And I'm always trying to get people to step up and lead, rise up into their gifting, their calling, whatever it is. But when nobody's stepping up and then somebody comes that's really got a lot of experience or gifting, I am really tempted to say, hey, here's my guy.
Especially if they want to lead.
If they want to lead, a lot of times people don't see themselves as qualified. So when somebody comes that wants to and is gifted, it is tempting for me to say, I finally got somebody that can be the next pastor to multiply this church, and to skip the process of really knowing how he treats his family, his wife, how he spends his money, to make sure he's not all the things that you read. And more than anything, that he's really close to Jesus, like he's in love with Jesus and he's humble. I remember Francis taught us that early on, like, how do you choose people? Somebody told him that I'd find humble people that are just close to the Lord. I know there's more than that, obviously, in the qualifications and all that, but when you find those things, you got to champion those things. The technique and even gifting you can grow in with practice. But character is something that God just graces people with, the ability to have a humble, teachable, moldable heart. The temptation is to skip that process of really knowing one another, to import leaders or to send out a resume. This person went to that school or that school and they know a whole bunch about that. But if you don't really know their character, it can be a downfall. It can hurt them and it can hurt the people they're shepherding. You have to really know people and their character before you put them in this position of leadership and shepherding people or having spiritual authority over people.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I think about the contrast to David, Saul. And Saul, I mean, people just looked at him and like, man, this dude's super tall. He's impressive. He's handsome. He seemed to have everything you would expect in a kingly leader. And his pride became his downfall. And the pride was connected to insecurity. Like that's part of what we need to be able to discern along the way. Is this person rooted in Jesus, rooted in the gospel, understanding their love by him and loving others out of that love, not out of earning, not trying to prove? Those are things that you can't tell on a resume. You can't figure out based on a couple of conversations. It's something you see over time. And that's one of the reasons that the appointing of leaders is something we want to see a lot of, but we also want to be slowly developing that over time relationally. So we want to give people opportunity to lead, but it's like coming out of discipleship. So if there's somebody where I go, man, it seems like this person could be a leader. It's not like, hey, go to this class, go get this educational training. That can be helpful, but primarily it's, man, like we've shared previously in our practices, everyone discipled in disciples. That person's going to be in discipleship relationship with others. As a pastor, if I'm seeing that in somebody, I might want to make sure I'm discipling him, really walking with him, seeing what's going on in his life. What sort of character do I see displayed? Those are the big things, right? Because Saul, based on first appearance, seemed great and he was doing well for a little while, but the character fell apart. And so my encouragement coming out of this video for anybody watching would be to think intentionally. One, if you're a congregant in a church, appreciate and have a new love for your leadership. They're not perfect. Rob and I are not perfect. Sometimes I think people can lift up We Are Church or any church that they're following along with and go, man, that church is just awesome. They're like killing it at everything. But the reality is, talk to anybody in our churches and it's like, oh yeah, there's Sean, there's Rob, there's Francis. It's not, we romanticize it, but the reality is every leader has shortcomings and flaws. My hope would be for you, whoever, watching this in the church, appreciate your leaders, see the positives and try to encourage them. If you're in a really unhealthy church body where you cannot come under the leadership, then it's probably time to start praying about moving to a different church. But that's a very serious decision to make and not something that should be entered in lightly. You can't be in a church bad-mouthing leadership and speaking against them. My appeal to the leaders listening to this, think so intentionally about how do you make sure this is about character? How do you make sure we try to simplify things so that we can raise up leaders without forcing them to need to be qualified in areas that the Bible does not lay out, where we kind of create a new standard for leadership? How do we try our best to see that the godliest, most faithful people are the ones in the highest level of leadership in the church? The tendency is for the most gifted, eloquent, educated, the most savvy in business. We got to get rid of that. Not that people with those skills can't be in leadership, but it has to be because of character, that the godliest, most faithful people are the ones who are in spiritual authority within the church. So thanks for listening in. Our next video, we'll be talking about how do we go about practically raising up leaders.